Welcome to Still Creative. My name is Eric Averett, and I had an opportunity to talk with Shelly Towns, Chief Marketing Officer at Marathon Health, which operates health centers for employers nationwide. The company was recently rated the #1 employer-sponsored health solution by KLAS Research. Shelly has been with Marathon since 2017, and prior to that was with Angie's List for over 12 years, where she started as a magazine writer and then grew into marketing and product leadership roles. Shelly earned an Indianapolis Business Journal Women of Influence Award and has served on several boards, including the United Way, TechPoint, and the Indy Chamber. On a personal note, Shelly is married and has 2 daughters. Our conversation included talking about how Shelly applies creativity in her leadership role, including through storytelling and building high-performance teams. As always, our context on Still Creative includes talking about creativity and links to the underlying condition of stillness. And thanks to Fusion Alliance, a New Era technology company, for their support of Still Creative. All right. Well, Shelly, thank you very much for joining me.
Of course. Thanks for the ask.
I was, as I shared with you, in terms of the name Still Creative, that's connected to my ongoing journey of finding more stillness, and by finding that stillness, sharing more of my creativity. So I'll actually start you out with a couple of 2-part questions, but can you tell me a little bit about yourself in terms of creativity in general, and then specifically how you can apply creativity in your Chief Marketing Officer role?
Yeah, sure. It's funny. I would say that for the most of my career, I would have considered myself a creative first. And when I think back to starting out and some of those individual contributor roles, my first job was a writer, which I definitely put in the creative category. And I wrote professionally for probably like 7 years or something, and then really found the business side of the startup I was at the time, which was Angie's List, and was able to, it was kind of an easy transition to parlay the writing skills into more of a marketing role. And as I moved into marketing and kind of got more and more responsibility over the years, which was really fun, I kind of felt maybe a little bit of a leveling out of some of the creativity for a while, because there was a lot of analytics that went into the role, and trying to find that sweet spot of creative while also, strategy and driving accountability and building teams and all of these things that go with that. I remember at one point we did these 360 reviews, and I got some feedback from a peer at the time to say, "Hey, I wish you were more creative," which was just almost shocking to me to read in writing that that somebody who I certainly respected and had been working with for a couple of years did not see me as a creative, because I always would have self-identified that way. But I found myself probably overcompensating on more of the analytical stuff, and I guess just doing things that maybe didn't naturally lend themselves to what people think of as creative. And I remember that moment thinking, that's not me. That's not how I want to show up. And so I just felt like I've been very intentional about finding that balance and making sure that I am applying my creativity. I think it's important for me, for my mental health and my natural strengths of who I am. It's where my head goes. And so making sure that I was showing up, I guess, a little more authentically, because I do think creativity is so important, regardless of your function, I guess.
That's excellent. I can certainly relate to that element of mental health and doing something creative and the good place that puts me in. The other thing that we talk a lot about on Still Creative is that this element of creativity and hard work and ultimately positive outcomes in organizations. So it's interesting to me that maybe your focus shifted to other areas, and then when that move back to showing up in a more creative way, it seems like those skills that you developed when your focus did shift will continue to serve you well. Would you agree with that?
Definitely. I think, I was very comfortable, am very comfortable in, Word and PowerPoint, was not as comfortable in Excel, for example. And that's a skill that I've learned and I think is valuable to me. And I like, spending time there. but I can't spend all my time there. And so how do I pull up appropriately? How can I leverage some of the writing? And, honestly, I think so much of leadership is storytelling. Being able to kind of cast a vision for a reality that doesn't exist yet, and getting people excited to follow, to get behind that vision, to want to achieve the vision together. And storytelling is very creative. And that's definitely a skill that I think I'm good at. I try to be good at and to improve. How do you say things in a way that get people excited? And I think, too, part of my background is a product management function. And a big thing of product design and product development is make something as real as possible, as fast as possible. It can't just be a conversation. How do you put it on a whiteboard or a screen just to give people the idea of like, oh, that's what it is. Yes, that's awesome. I want to do that. And so how do you do that at scale with maybe, teams of 5, 10, hundreds, thousands of people, and especially now when people aren't under the same roof and we're very distributed, I think that storytelling and that narrative is even more important. And so finding an outlet for that has been really helpful for me, and just trying to hone those skills.
That's excellent. You mentioned that idea of showing versus telling.
Yeah.
And to me, just looking at those two options and seeing the showing as a more creative approach. And so, that definitely jumped out at me. And as you think about being a leader, one of the things that we talk about is creativity at an individual level or creativity within teams and organizations. And so from the standpoint of one piece of that, it's feedback, which you mentioned. Can you talk a little bit about your own experience with feedback and your thoughts related to giving feedback as a leader of a team, feedback in an effective, productive way?
I can remember one of the first things too, and I think you have to remember for myself, like I'm a marketer at heart, and marketing is all about, promotion and how do we tell these great stories and kind of tell about all these great things that we do. And I remember one of my first opportunities, I became a direct report to our CEO. And this was at Angie's List. And I started to report to Bill Osterly directly. And I remember getting ready for that first meeting. And I knew Bill. I'd worked for him in a different capacity for a while, but reporting to him was different. And I remember thinking like, okay, I'm going to go in here and I've got this agenda. I've got some dedicated time with him. What do I want to talk about? And my first thought was, I'm going to go tell him about all these things that are going well. And I remember talking to a friend of mine at the time who had been reporting to him for a while. And he said, no, you need to go in there and tell him what's not going well, which like violated everything that I thought as a marketer, like, what, the baby's not ugly. And it was such a light bulb moment for me in terms of how do you get comfortable when saying things aren't going well and asking for help and suggesting something that maybe you're not sure how to solve, or, I felt like that might be a sign of weakness. And so that was a really big aha moment for me. And it was great feedback that I continue to think about today. Being very comfortable giving quote unquote bad news. And I think too, if it's not a surprise, that's a different kind of bad news. But like I tell my teams all the time, we do red, yellow, greens kind of status updates. And, red is not a sign of weakness. Red is a sign of professional maturity. Like I know enough to know that this isn't going well. We're off track, but here's what we're going to do to get it off track. That's great feedback. And so I'm trying to create a team environment where people feel safe to ask for help, to say something's not going well, to say, I don't know how to solve this problem, and that we can figure it out together. And so I think being able to both hear feedback thoughtfully, and I will tell you that it's always a work in progress. I tend to get defensive. I always am working on that, but being able to take feedback and being able to give feedback in a way that makes people feel heard and that you care about them. I think some of the best feedback I've been given is, the one I mentioned of, be willing and able to say what's not going well. That was a really good one for me. The other one was Debbie Rout, who serves as our chief people experience officer at Marathon Health and has become a good friend of mine and a mentor, just said, you can be intentional without being intense. Sometimes I try to be efficient to a fault. skirt the small talk, let's just get right to it. And that's not always the best way to build relationships and to build trust. And so I always want to be thoughtful. I think I hate the idea of kind of wasting time. And I think, so I've worked very hard to try to find a balance where I can be intentional, but I don't have to scare people in the process. And so that was another just really good one for me that I often reflect on and think about. And I think, this idea of just performance feedback. I heard something just recently, actually. It was like the goal of feedback isn't to make somebody feel good, it's to make their work better. Now that's not an excuse to not be thoughtful or humane and in the way empathetic in the way that you give that feedback. But I thought that was a really nice distinction. And I think high performers, great talent, expect constructive feedback. And so getting comfortable with providing that, I feel that that's a responsibility. And so just kind of been, it's always a practice to try to be good at that and to find things that people can, work on and that want to do better on. So.
Excellent. That's one of the things that I've learned from just talking with you and thinking about my own approach to business, and that idea of thinking about you can be intentional without being intense. And I always want to be very efficient, but for me, perhaps that is too much of what my focus is. And so thanks for passing along that lesson learned.
Well, thanks to Debbie. She's the one that planted that seed, and it was a great call out too.
That's a great example of another common theme of my still creative discussions, is this combination of creativity and discipline. And I hear so many examples talking with you of the discipline that you apply to your work. And so discipline is one element, and we talked about this being confident enough to say no as another example of discipline. Can you talk about that confidence to say no and why that's important?
Yeah, I think, and again, too, when you think about like true creatives that, it's their life's work and it's a passion. I think there's always an element, and this is true of non-creatives too. There's some folks that just, They want to say yes, and they feel like saying no is mean or disrespectful, or I'm not giving it all I got, and I just don't think that's true. And I will say, for me, that was a learned behavior. I definitely erred on the side of trying to do everything that was asked, and at some point you kind of get to that moment of like, man, you can't do it all. And so it is appropriate to say no, but I think getting comfortable with how you say no. And I think in order to say no, you have to know, you at least have to have an awareness of what you should be working on, which is hard. It's the hardest thing. And I think it will always be the hardest part of my job, is figuring out what are those real priorities so that you have that backstop. I think there's this perception of, there's just this room somewhere at the top of the hill where all the smart people get together and they just innately know the right answer. And that room just doesn't exist. And so constantly honing your own process for figuring out what should I be working on? How do I add value? How do I add the most value? And in response to that, it makes it a little easier to figure out, hey, that thing doesn't really add a lot of value, and that isn't the best use of my time. And so I think what I focus on a lot for myself and with my team is there's really not a whole lot of yes or black and white answers. Every once in a while you get lucky and there's just something that's so obvious, but for the most part it's gray. And so I focus with my teams less on being right and more on being defensible. Let's make a defensible decision. If somebody asked us, how did you make that decision, that you could explain it in a way they're like, oh, sounds good, And I think getting people comfortable with their own process for saying no. Maybe it's, hey, when do you need this by? Inserting a little bit of friction into the process. And it's funny how many people go away when you start to add a little bit of a tax to the system of, when do you need this by? And hey, can you remind me what problem we're solving? Hey, are you sure this is the right thing now? Here's what I'm working on. Is this more important than that? That tends to diminish the asks a little bit on its own. And I think it makes the person that feels a little bit heartburn about saying no, maybe a little bit of grievance that, hey, I'm not exactly saying no, but maybe I'm saying not now. And that feels a little more palatable for folks.
Excellent. Excellent. Well, being thoughtful about how you say no and being thoughtful about how you give feedback and, these skills that make people, make you a better leader. And, going back to creativity, being someone who is well received and is able to share stories and to motivate and inspire people that way, get to utilize those creative skills that are just naturally a part of who they are. So all these other things are so important.
Yeah.
We talked about curiosity as well. And, you strike me as a curious person. You mentioned being curious about how other leaders run meetings as just one example. Can you talk to me about your observations around curiosity and teams?
Yeah. I think curiosity is that skill that it doesn't really show up on a resume or a LinkedIn profile, but it's one of the most valuable traits, in my opinion. And I don't know if you can really teach curiosity. I think you can inflame it and create an environment where you're more insatiable and kind of just the ideas fire a little more, and kind of, again, creating those environments that encourage like asking why. As opposed to some where maybe it's just very controlled or a little more structured. I think curiosity is one of the best skills and one of the biggest enablers of team success. And I think it's true, for example, you always think about, like, you run a retrospective with a team. We just did this big project, or we shipped a big product or a new feature, and you do a retro to say, hey, how'd it go? Anything we would have done differently? I think it's as valuable to do that when things are going really well as it is when things maybe didn't go as well as you wanted. That constant desire to learn. At the end of the day, I think all of us are hopefully on this journey of self-improvement and learning, and just being naturally curious about the people around you, on a personal and a professional level, about the projects at hand, about the market, the problems you're trying to solve, the results. Why did that test perform that way, or why did that new hire not work out? I think just that constant curiosity, that itch that you just have to scratch, and doing that through conversation, through books, through, podcasts or webinars, or, just networking. I'm a huge fan of that. And I think part of curiosity is being willing. You got to be willing to admit, like, I don't know the answer. Let's go find out. And so there's a little bit of vulnerability that comes with that. But that willingness to ask ask one more question. The things you'll learn about your colleagues or about your peers or your teams or your customers, it's that when I think back to my days as a journalist, and so much of that was foundational for me, I never finished an interview without saying, is there anything else that I should have asked? Any questions I didn't ask that you'd like to talk about? And man, if that wasn't always, some of the greatest insights I would get at the end of that interview. And it's just that, what if I were going to ask one more thing, what could it be? And so that's kind of what I think about. And sometimes it drives people crazy. But I think it's just so valuable, and it demonstrates a desire to know more. And I think people like sharing, So.
I agree. I think people, like sharing and being engaged in conversations with people who, are curious and ask those extra questions. But your self-awareness is there as well. And I can relate to that.
My husband reminds me all the time that, hey, maybe you don't have to ask all those questions,
Yes. So and I'm glad that I asked you that question as well about, things that would be, interesting to talk about. Uh-huh. And, one of the things that by asking that question of you, we found that common ground of being interested in teams and team building. Yep. And I know that that's one of your favorite areas where you've been able to apply creativity. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I think Yeah, I think you're referencing The Boys in the Boat, which is one of our favorite books as a shared learning as we were getting to know each other better. I'm a big reader, and I am a little bit of probably a leadership junkie in the sense of I love learning from other leaders. I love watching them. I like reading about them. I'm more interested in the more of like the biographical examples as opposed to the academic ones, I guess. But I love military history and military leadership and how those leadership skills can apply to some of that problem solving. I was able to take a class or I guess a program through IU. It's been I guess 8 years ago now, but there's a leadership, the Tobias Leadership Center through IU. And it was a really cool opportunity for me for a year with a cohort to just go through leadership training and more of those soft skills. And one of the things we studied was Shackleton. And so Ernest Shackleton was a famous explorer and at the time was one of the first to attempt to go as far south as the South Pole. And they, I think, famously got stuck in some ice. And I remember one of the things that really resonated with me about his experience was when he was planning that trip, for probably a year before they set sail, there was a lot of planning. What supplies do we need? What kind of crew do I want? And he was an accomplished sailor. And so from a technical skill standpoint, he knew he needed sailors. I think that's very obvious, but I think the analogy for all of us, you always know you need those technical skills and kind of maybe what skills you need. But for him, he knew that there was risk involved in the journey, and he knew that being stuck was a possibility, and he planned for that possibility. And he said, you know what, I need somebody who's going to lighten the mood if we get stuck. And he handpicked a musician to come on that trip who had no sailing experience. And I think the foresight and the creativity with that team building was so interesting and really resonated with me because they did get stuck, and they got stuck for, I think, 18 months. And not one man, there was no mutiny, no one died, they survived and they were rescued. And I think that musician, there's some really good anecdotes in the book about that musician really cut the tension on a lot of fronts. And I think at the time, there were several sailors on the boat questioning that decision to bring somebody along because every man had to serve a purpose, and the ship, you can only take so many things and so many supplies. And I think there was a lot of skepticism around whether that was the right hire. But his leadership was three-dimensional, and he foresaw that risk and planned accordingly. And it really played in his favor. And so I think always using that example in my own world of like, where do I need the technical competence? There's some roles you just can't learn by experience or learn by trying, There's some times in the organization where I just need somebody who knows how to do this right now. I can't afford to let them learn on the job. I always try to preserve a few roles where you are learning on the job and you are taking that creative leap to say, hey, for the greater good of the team and for real optimization, what are those creative gaps where we could fill with maybe a non-technical person or somebody who just adds a perspective that we don't have on the team today, And I think that's where that creativity with leadership and team building and optimization comes into play. And that's a really fun muscle to work and one that I really enjoy because those team dynamics are everything. We've all been part of like teams that suck and you're just like, ugh, I don't want to go in or I don't care if we get this done on time or not because I don't really care about the people I'm doing it with. And when you do care about the people, you get so much more done and you get it done in a way that's more fulfilling. And I feel a responsibility to build teams that enjoy one another, and I think, I always think about like what would the people on the team go home and tell their spouse at night or their partner or their roommate? What would they say about the work environment? And there's a responsibility to hopefully, and don't get me wrong, some days there's just bad days, but you can't have bad months and bad quarters. And if that's true, I think either the leader or the team member, maybe it's just a wrong fit. But certainly feel a responsibility to create those team dynamics where people, feel respected, enjoy the people they're working alongside, have fun, and feel that they can really bring their full selves to work and show up in a genuine way. Because work's hard, and that's the best. I think that's the least we could do for people. And I know that's what I want. So.
Excellent. Well, yeah, and thank you for sharing that example, which I was not familiar with, the musician on the expedition, but it did make me think of one of my favorite quotes from one of our favorite books, as we've learned, The Boys in the Boat. That book being about an Olympic rowing crew, and the quote that I'll share. The description from the book is: good crews are a good blend of personalities. Someone to lead the charge, someone to hold something in reserve, someone to pick a fight, someone to make peace, someone to think things through, someone to charge ahead without thinking. So I remember reading that and knowing very little about rowing, and that contrast of what I thought picking a rowing crew or team would look like relative to that reality of needing all those different personalities.
Yeah,
is why I made that connection.
absolutely. I love that. I think too, I mean, you have to know, I mean, we all have blind spots, and there are things that I'm good at and there's things I'm not good at. And so understanding what I'm not good at and making sure that I'm surrounding myself with people that are good at that. I would say I'm very risk tolerant. I'm not afraid to push the envelope. I'm not afraid to make decisions fast. But I also want to I've also always surrounded myself with people that are a little more reserved to do a bit of a speed bump for myself and save me from myself in some situations. Because there are times where I am ready to make that decision, but then I've got that counsel that's saying, hey, listen, have you thought about this? And maybe I hadn't. And so just recognizing those blind spots and that the yin and yang personalities, like you called out from the book, and looking across the team and for yourself to make sure that you've got that advisory board, whether that's kind of intentional or not. I think about that quote unquote board of directors for yourself. And when I'm working on something for myself, like from a professional development standpoint, I always like to have a wingman at work to say, hey, somebody that you're in meetings with a lot or spend a lot of time with, to say, hey, I'm working on this thing. When you see me do it well, will you tell me in the moment? And when I don't do it well, will you tell me, hey, I'm trying not to talk so much in these meetings. I've got a great team. I really want them to shine. I tend to be the first person to speak, and I'm aware of that. And I try to not do that. And so I'll often ask a colleague that I'm with a lot to say, hey, tell me when I talk too much in that room, or tell me when I did this other thing, because I think that another thing with feedback is you can't wait for the annual review cycle. It's got to be frequent, and making sure that you're around people that you trust enough to give and get feedback frequently, I think is really valuable.
It's an example, as you were sharing, building a team and those times where there is the opportunity to be more creative. One example that you shared with me was finding this opportunity to bring in the right person on their quality of empathy. Mm-hmm. And empathy jumped out at me as an example as it relates to stillness and my mindset around mindfulness and awareness and stillness. And someone who has those qualities, as I personally see them, is able to be empathetic and to bring that quality. Can you share that example?
I think empathy is so good, and it can be a little bit nuanced, and one of the examples that comes to mind is when I had the chance to build a product team at Angie's List. And I think when you think about product, and obviously you're trying to build a solution for an end user, and I think in our case, but I think in lots of cases, some of the best employees who just have so much great empathy, they're in your call centers, your customer service organizations. They talk to your customers all day, every day, and they have such a wealth of knowledge. And so, to my point about sometimes, depending on the organization, you have the luxury of learning on the job. And sometimes you really just have to hit the ground with experience. I've been there, done that. I've got the pattern recognition, and Eric and you and I talked about that a little bit. And I think I had the luxury at Angie's List of doing both. We needed a large enough product organization. The first order of business was bringing in true product expertise that knew the process and the artifacts and the how to work with development teams and all of that. But as that started to solidify, I felt the luxury of being able to bring on maybe some non-traditional product folks. And a few people come to mind. We had a great call center organization. Erin Stahl led an amazing team, and we often would poach from her team because it was such a great training ground for what the business did and what our customers cared about. And so the opportunity to bring some folks over from the call center, Brent McKay, who is now at Meta as a product manager, and Jake Trowbridge, who is now doing a great job in product management at Innovate Map, one of my favorite indie companies, come to mind. And Josh Billman is another example, who's now at HC1. Those guys just had so much empathy and so much knowledge about the business because of their call center experience. And they came over and hit the ground running in product. And they were able to augment those product kind of more experienced product technicians that we were able to hire, because they knew product development, but they didn't know our customers. And what made the team so special was that we were able to get kind of a balance of both over time. And some of that empathy just takes a time to develop, and in some cases, just doesn't develop. But in product, it was such a valuable skill, and finding those kind of gems within our existing organization, just wearing a different hat at the time, was such a valuable addition. And those guys have all gone on to have very big product careers. And we keep in touch to this day, and very proud of all of them. And that was a really fun thing to learn that was possible, and always looking for those things that I could replicate like that. That was a special time.
Excellent. Well, thank you for sharing that example. It's
Yeah.
such a powerful one in terms of leadership and the impact that leaders can have, not only in this case on achieving the goals that you were working to achieve at that time, but on individuals' careers. And that element of creativity in this particular case is a great example to wrap up on.
Yeah.
So thank you for the time that you've shared, and the energy you put into being a leader really stands out for me, and your ability to apply the creativity that you have. And so glad we had a chance to talk. Thank you, Shelly, for joining me.
Thanks, Eric. This was fun, and it's always fun to talk and to reflect on some of this stuff. So I appreciate the invite. Thanks so much.